The sterile white light of the hospital corridor flickered as Mark threw the signed divorce papers onto the foot of Elena's bed. He didn't look at the 4 plastic bassinets humming in the corner, the financial anchors that had just ruined his life. "I'm done, Elena," he spat, his voice devoid of the warmth he'd promised her 5 years ago. "I signed up for a wife, not a charity ward. You keep the house, you keep the kids, and you keep the struggle. I'm choosing my freedom." He didn't wait for her to stop crying. He didn't even look back as he walked out of the maternity wing, leaving a woman who could barely sit up to raise 4 human beings alone. 3 hours later, Mark was at a high-end bar, nursing a scotch and celebrating his escape, when every television screen in the lounge synced to a breaking news bulletin. Global market shock. The Silas Vane estate finally settled. Mark froze. Silas Vane was the reclusive copper tycoon who had died 6 months ago without a known heir. He was also Elena's estranged grandfather, the man she claimed had vanished decades ago. The news anchor's voice trembled with the weight of the numbers. After a private DNA confirmation finalized this afternoon, the $500 billion Vane empire, encompassing global shipping, tech conglomerates, and the largest private gold reserve in the world, has officially passed to his only living relative. A photo flashed on the screen. It wasn't a corporate headshot. It was a grainy, candid photo of Elena. The heiress, Elena Vane Sterling, was located just hours ago in a local municipal hospital, the anchor continued. In a staggering turn of events, the inheritance was contingent on the birth of a new generation. With the arrival of her quadruplets this morning, the continuity clause was triggered. As of 2 p.m., Elena Sterling is the wealthiest woman on the planet. Mark's glass shattered on the floor. The timing hit him like a physical blow. He looked at his watch, 2:45 p.m. The timestamp on his divorce filing, 2:15 p.m. He had walked away from the biggest fortune in human history by a margin of 30 minutes. But as he scrambled to his feet, his mind racing with apologies and mistakes, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number, Elena's new legal team. "Mr. Sterling, we have received your filed divorce decree. Per the Vane estate's infidelity and desertion protocols, your waiver of marital assets is irrevocable. Thank you for making this transition so simple. Your access to the hospital wing has been revoked. Security is waiting outside your apartment." The scotch turned to lead in his stomach. He hadn't just left a woman and 4 babies, he had walked out of a kingdom. And the most terrifying part? The look in Elena's eyes when he left wasn't just heartbreak. It was the look of someone who finally knew exactly what he was worth. "Before we continue this incredible journey together, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now telling me where in the world you're watching this from. Whether you're in a bustling city or a quiet town, I want to know. And while you're at it, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell. You don't want to miss what happens next in this story. Trust me on that. Now, let's rewind. Because to truly understand the magnitude of what Mark had just thrown away, you need to understand who Elena really was before she became the woman holding divorce papers in a hospital bed. Elena's story didn't begin in that maternity ward. It began 28 years earlier, in a small coastal town called Meridian Bay, where the fog rolled in thick enough to hide secrets and the fishing boats came home with catches too small to feed growing families. Her mother, Rosalind, had been a woman of extraordinary beauty and even more extraordinary pain. At 19, Rosalind had fallen in love with a man named Julian Vane, the rebellious son of the copper magnate Silas Vane. Their love affair was the stuff of whispered legends in Meridian Bay. Dorian, with his dark curly hair and infectious laugh, had defied his father's empire to chase waves and paint sunsets on forgotten beaches. Rosalind had been his muse, his anchor, his everything. But Silas Vane did not become a billionaire by tolerating rebellion. When he discovered his only son had married a fisherman's daughter in a secret ceremony, he issued an ultimatum: annul the marriage and return to the empire, or be erased from the Vane legacy entirely. Dorian chose love. He chose Rosalind. He chose the baby growing in her belly. Silas, true to his word, severed every tie. Dorian Vane ceased to exist in the boardrooms and bank accounts of the Vane empire. The family that had once commanded nations now pretended he had never been born. For 3 years, Dorian and Rosalind lived in blissful poverty. They had Elena, a daughter with her father's dark curls and her mother's fierce green eyes. They scraped by on Dorian's paintings and Rosalind's seamstress work. They were happy. Then came the accident. A fishing boat, a storm, and Dorian Vane was swallowed by the same sea he had loved. Elena was 3 years old when she lost her father. She would grow up with only fragments of him, a paint-stained easel, a leather journal filled with sketches of her mother, and stories whispered late at night about the grandfather who lived in a castle made of copper and gold. Rosalind never recovered. She raised Elena with fierce love and quiet desperation, working herself to the bone to provide what she could. She never sought help from the Vane family. Pride, she called it. Protection, Elena would later understand. Rosalind knew that Silas Vane was not a man who gave without taking. She would not let her daughter become a pawn in an empire built on coldness. When Elena was 16, Rosalind's heart finally gave out. The doctors called it cardiac arrest. Elena knew it was heartbreak, accumulated over 13 years of loving a ghost and fighting a world that didn't care about widows and orphans. Elena was placed in the foster system. She was shuffled between homes, never staying long enough to form attachments, never quite fitting into spaces designed for children without edges. She had too many edges. Too many questions. Too much of her grandfather's steel in her spine, though she didn't know it yet. At 18, Elena aged out of the system with nothing but a high school diploma, her father's journal, and a burning determination to make something of herself. She worked 2 jobs while attending community college. She tutored children in the morning and cleaned office buildings at night. She slept 4 hours and dreamed of a life where she didn't have to count every penny like it might be her last. It was during one of those night cleaning shifts that she met Mark Sterling. Mark was 25 then, a junior account manager at Whitmore Financial, the company whose offices Elena scrubbed clean every evening. He was charming in the way that men who have never known hunger are charming, effortlessly, carelessly, as if the world owed them attention and they were merely collecting what was due. He noticed Elena one night when he was working late on a presentation. She was emptying his trash can, invisible the way cleaning staff were supposed to be, when he looked up and really saw her. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun. Her green eyes were tired but sharp. She was reading a battered copy of The Count of Monte Cristo during her break, and he asked her about it. Revenge fantasy or justice story, he had asked, gesturing at the book. Elena had looked at him with an expression that should have been a warning. Both, she said. Sometimes they're the same thing. Mark was intrigued. Here was a woman who cleaned toilets and read classics, who had nothing and acted like she needed nothing. She was a challenge, a puzzle, something different from the polished sorority girls who bored him at networking events. He pursued her with the single-minded focus of a man who always got what he wanted. He brought her coffee during her shifts. He waited in the parking lot to walk her to her bus stop. He told her she was extraordinary, that she deserved more, that he would give her the world if she would let him. Elena resisted at first. She had learned not to trust easy promises. But Mark was persistent, and more importantly, he was consistent. For 2 years, he showed up. He met her after classes. He celebrated when she graduated with honors. He introduced her to his family, upper-middle-class people who looked at Elena like she was a curiosity but tolerated her because Mark seemed so devoted. When Mark proposed on her 24th birthday, Elena said yes. Not because she believed in fairy tales, she had long ago stopped believing in those, but because she believed in him. She believed in the man who had seen her when she was invisible and chosen her anyway. They married in a small ceremony. Elena wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved across all her foster homes in a box she never let go of. Mark complained privately to his friends about the modest venue, but he smiled through the photos and told Elena she was beautiful. For 2 years, things were good. Not perfect, Elena knew perfect was a lie, but good. Mark climbed the corporate ladder at Whitmore Financial. Elena found work at a non-profit that helped foster children find stable homes. They bought a small house with a mortgage that made Elena nervous and a backyard that made her dream of children playing in summer sunlight. Then Elena got pregnant. And not just pregnant, spectacularly pregnant. The ultrasound revealed not 1 baby, not 2, but 4. Quadruplets. The doctor used words like miracle and rare and high risk. Mark used words like impossible and expensive and, are you sure we can't reduce? Elena had stared at him when he suggested that. Actually stared, as if seeing him for the first time. There are children, she said quietly. All 4 of them. Mark backed down, but something shifted between them. He started working later. Coming home smelling of perfume he claimed was a colleague's. Making comments about the money they would need, the sacrifices they would have to make, the life they were giving up for this. Elena knew. Somewhere deep in her bones, in the part of her that had survived foster homes and grief and loneliness, she knew she was losing him. But she was 6 months pregnant with 4 babies, and survival mode meant focusing on what she could control. She couldn't control Mark's wandering eyes. But she could control the tiny humans growing inside her. She could love them fiercely enough for 2 parents, the way her mother had loved her. What Elena didn't know, couldn't have known, was that across the world, in a hospital bed in Monaco, an old man was dying with her photograph clutched in his withered hands. Silas Vane had lived for 93 years, and he had spent the last 40 of them trying to undo his greatest mistake. The day he cast out his son Dorian, he believed he was teaching a lesson about duty, about legacy, about the hard choices that built empires. He believed Dorian would come crawling back within a year, humbled and ready to take his rightful place at the helm of the Vane Corporation. Instead, Dorian vanished. And by the time Silas's pride had cooled enough to send investigators to find him, his son was already 3 years dead, drowned in a storm off the coast of a town Silas had never heard of. The guilt nearly destroyed him. Not outwardly, Silas Vane never showed weakness to the world. He continued to build his empire, acquiring shipping companies and tech startups and mineral rights across 6 continents. He became one of the wealthiest men in human history, a titan whose very name moved markets. But privately, Silas was haunted. He hired investigators to track down any trace of his son's life. He discovered that Dorian had left behind a widow and a daughter. He watched from a distance as Rosalind worked herself into an early grave, wanting to help but knowing that his help would be unwelcome, that he had forfeited the right to be anything but a ghost in their lives. When Rosalind died, Silas nearly reached out. He had the letters drafted. He had the private jets on standby. But then he saw the news coverage of Rosalind's funeral, a brief mention in a local paper, and the photograph of her daughter, Elena. She was 16, fierce and grieving, and so achingly like Dorian that Silas could barely breathe. And standing beside her at the funeral, visible in the background of the photo, were representatives from the foster care system. Social workers in sensible shoes, ready to take his granddaughter into a system that would never understand what she was worth. Silas made a decision that day. One that would shape both their lives in ways neither could imagine. He would not reach out to Elena. Not yet. She was young, vulnerable, and his sudden appearance would upend her life in ways that might not serve her well. The world was full of opportunists who would see a connection to the vain fortune as an opportunity for exploitation. If Elena became publicly known as his heir at 16, she would never know who loved her for herself and who loved her for her money. So instead, Silas watched. He set up a network of silent protections, scholarships that appeared through community programs, medical bills that got mysteriously paid, job opportunities that seemed like lucky breaks. When Elena was shuffled from one foster home to another, it was Silas's investigators who ensured she ended up in the homes that were safe, that had good people, that would at least not damage the granddaughter he was too proud and too guilty to face. He watched her graduate from high school. He watched her work her way through college. He saw her meeting with Mark Sterling and felt an immediate, visceral distrust that he couldn't quite explain. The man smiled too easily. Gave up too little. Took credit for loving Elena as if it were a sacrifice rather than a privilege. But Elena was an adult, and Silas had given up his right to interfere. He could only watch, and worry, and pour his energy into building a legacy worthy of the granddaughter who had no idea he existed. In his final years, Silas became obsessed with ensuring that his empire would not simply pass to corporate boards and distant relatives who had never known hardship. He rewrote his will 17 times. He added clauses and conditions that made his lawyers nervous and his rivals salivate with anticipation. The continuity clause was his masterstroke. The vain fortune would only pass to a direct descendant who proved they could create and nurture life. Not just inherit, but continue. Not just take, but give. Silas believed that the capacity for parenthood, for loving something more than oneself, was the truest test of character. He had failed that test with Dorian. He prayed Elena would succeed. When he died, 6 months before Elena gave birth to her quadruplets, Silas Vane left behind instructions for his legal team. Find Elena. Confirm her identity through DNA. And wait. Wait for her to fulfill the clause that would unlock everything. The team, led by a formidable woman named Octavia Langford, followed his instructions to the letter. Now, back in that hospital room, as Elena absorbed the news that had just turned her world inside out, Octavia Langford entered with the quiet confidence of a woman who had negotiated with presidents and oligarchs. She was 62 years old, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Elena's annual salary. Behind her were 2 younger associates carrying leather briefcases and tablets, and a security detail that remained discreetly outside the door. Elena had stopped crying. The divorce papers still lay at the foot of her bed, Mark's signature still fresh, a document that 30 minutes ago had seemed like the end of her world. Now it felt like something else entirely. A key, perhaps. Or a door. Mrs. Sterling, Octavia began, then paused, a slight smile crossing her composed features. I suppose that title is no longer accurate. Ms. Vane. Or, if you prefer, Elena. Elena looked at the bassinets where her 4 children slept in peaceful oblivion, unaware that they had just been born into wealth beyond comprehension. "Just Elena," she said quietly. "For now." Octavia nodded approvingly. "Your grandfather hoped you would say something like that. He said you had his practicality and your father's heart. He was afraid you would have neither." "I didn't know I had a grandfather until my mother mentioned him when she was dying," Elena said. "She told me to stay away from the Vane family. That they would consume me." She wasn't wrong to be cautious, Octavia acknowledged. Power of this magnitude attracts predators. Your grandfather was one of them, once. He spent his final decades trying to become something better. Whether he succeeded is something you'll have to judge for yourself. She placed a leather folder on the bed beside Elena. "This contains the immediate summary. The full documentation will take months to review. There are assets in 47 countries, legal entities in the hundreds, and investments in nearly every major industry on Earth. But the essential points are these: you are now the sole owner of the Vane Corporation and all its subsidiaries. The estimated value is $500 billion, though the actual figure fluctuates daily based on market conditions." Elena didn't open the folder. She kept her eyes on her sleeping children. "And the continuity clause?" "Met as of 2 p.m. today, when your children were officially recorded as born. Your grandfather believed that the capacity to create life was the most important quality in an heir. He was estranged from his own child and never had the chance to be a grandfather while you were growing up. He didn't want the Vane legacy to continue through people who saw children as inconveniences or strategic assets. Let me ask you something before we continue. Have you ever had someone show you their true colors at the exact moment when you needed them most? That moment when someone reveals exactly who they are, and you realize you never really knew them at all? Drop a comment and tell me about it. I want to hear your story. Now, back to Elena. The irony wasn't lost on her. Mark had called the Quadruplets financial anchors. He had walked out precisely because he didn't want the burden of 4 children. And in doing so, he had walked away from more money than most nations' GDP. "What about Mark?" she asked. Octavia's expression remained neutral, but there was a hint of something like satisfaction in her eyes. Your grandfather anticipated that any spouse would need to be evaluated carefully. The estate includes specific provisions for situations involving desertion or infidelity. Your husband, ex-husband, as of 15 minutes ago, filed for divorce and explicitly waived any claims to marital assets. He did this before the inheritance was publicly announced. Under the estate's protocols, that waiver is irrevocable. He cannot contest, appeal, or negotiate. He gets exactly what he asked for, nothing. Elena closed her eyes. She should have felt vindicated. Part of her did. But mostly she felt tired. Tired of being underestimated. Tired of being abandoned. Tired of men deciding she wasn't worth the trouble. "There's more," Octavia continued. "Your grandfather left personal letters for you. He wrote one every month for the last 15 years, documenting his thoughts, his regrets, his hopes for you. They're in a private vault in Geneva. He wanted you to know him, even though he never found the courage to introduce himself while he lived." Something cracked in Elena's chest. This man, this grandfather she had never known, had spent years watching her struggle, helping in secret, dying with her photograph in his hands. And she had never even known his face. "Why didn't he reach out?" she whispered. Octavia's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something softer beneath. "Shame," she said simply. "He destroyed his relationship with your father through pride and control. He was terrified of destroying his relationship with you the same way. He believed you deserved the chance to build your own life without the weight of his legacy. He wanted to give you roots, not chains. Elena opened her eyes and looked at the folder. And now? Now you have both. The roots he tried to give you secretly. And the chains, or the wings, of an empire that has been waiting for you since before you were born. One of the babies stirred. A tiny sound, not quite a cry, just the soft vocalization of new life adjusting to a strange world. Elena reached instinctively toward the bassinet closest to her, touching the small, warm bundle through the plastic. What are their names? Octavia asked gently. Elena looked at her 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, according to the doctors. She hadn't had time to decide yet. Mark had been dismissive every time she tried to discuss names, saying there was no point getting attached until they knew if they could afford to keep the house. Keep the house. As if shelter was optional. As if love was a luxury. I haven't decided, Elena said. I wanted to meet them first. Know who they were. Octavia nodded. That's exactly what your grandfather would have wanted. He believed names should be earned, not assigned. She paused. Elena, there's going to be a great deal of attention on you in the coming days. Media, business interests, people you've never met claiming to be old friends. I've arranged for you to be transferred to a private medical facility within the hour. Your children will receive the best care available. You'll have time to heal, to bond with them, and to decide how you want to approach all of this. And Mark? Mr. Sterling's access has been revoked from this hospital and from any property associated with you or your children. If he attempts to contact you without your permission, he will be met with a restraining order and a legal team that has successfully prosecuted corporate espionage cases against nations. For the first time since Mark had walked out, Elena smiled. It was small, tired, and edged with something that might have been grief or might have been rage. But it was real. He's going to try to come back, she said. When he realizes what he's lost. Octavia's smile was shark-like. I'm counting on it. Mark Sterling's downfall began the moment he stepped out of that bar, his mind racing with calculations and contingencies. He had called Elena 47 times before her number was disconnected. He had driven to the hospital, only to be stopped at the entrance by security guards who looked at him with the polite contempt reserved for people who no longer mattered. He had called her friends, the few she had, and been met with silence or hostility. By midnight, he was pacing his apartment, watching news coverage of his ex-wife's sudden elevation to the ranks of the ultra-wealthy. Every channel had the story. Every financial analyst was speculating about what Elena Vane would do with her grandfather's empire. Every tabloid was already digging into her past, uncovering the story of the reclusive heiress who had been hiding in plain sight. And in every story, Mark was a footnote. The husband who left. The man who walked out on his wife hours before she became the richest woman alive. The punchline to a cosmic joke. His phone rang. It was his mother, Delphine Sterling, a woman who had spent her entire life climbing social ladders and marrying progressively wealthier men. She was on her 4th husband now, a retired pharmaceutical executive whose primary contribution to their marriage was staying out of her way. Mark, what have you done? Delphine's voice was shrill with controlled panic. I'm getting calls from everyone. Everyone, Mark. The Whitmore partners. The country club. People I haven't spoken to in years. They're all asking about Elena. About you. About whether this divorce is real. It's real, Mark said flatly. I filed the papers this afternoon. Before the announcement? Mark, please tell me you're joking. Please tell me this is some kind of strategy. I didn't know, Mother. How could I have known? Delphine was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was cold. Then you fix this. You apologize. You beg. You do whatever it takes to get back into that woman's good graces. Do you understand me? This family's reputation. It's too late, Mark interrupted. Her legal team contacted me. The divorce is irrevocable. Some clause in the estate about desertion. I can't undo it. Another silence. Longer this time. Then you are no son of mine, Delphine said quietly, and hung up. Mark stared at the phone. His mother had always been transactional in her affections, but to hear her dismiss him so completely, so finally, it was like a door slamming on his entire childhood. He threw the phone across the room and watched it shatter against the wall. The satisfying crash did nothing to ease the pressure building in his chest. Over the following weeks, Mark's life unraveled with the precision of a well-orchestrated demolition. It started with his job. Whitmore Financial had been eager to have him when he was a rising star with a beautiful wife and a promising future. Now, they were eager to distance themselves from the man whose face was becoming synonymous with foolish choices. The partners called him in for a meeting, expressed their concerns about the distraction his personal situation was causing, and suggested he take a leave of absence. Indefinitely. Then came the social exile. Mark had always prided himself on his network, the golf buddies, the college friends, the industry contacts who invited him to exclusive parties and private clubs. Within 2 weeks of the announcement, his calls went unreturned, his invitations dried up, and the few people who did respond did so with barely concealed schadenfreude. Gavin Merrick, his oldest friend and former college roommate, was the only one who agreed to meet him for drinks. They sat in a corner booth at a bar far less upscale than Mark's usual haunts, and Gavin looked at him with a mixture of pity and fascination. You know what people are saying, right? Gavin asked, swirling his whiskey. They're saying you must have known. That you found out about the inheritance and panicked because you didn't want to be overshadowed by your wife's money. That's insane. I had no idea. Doesn't matter what's true, Mark. Matters what people believe. And right now, people believe you're either the biggest fool in financial history or the biggest coward. Neither one looks good on a resume. Mark wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Because deep down, he knew that people weren't entirely wrong. He had known Elena was different. He had known she was stronger than him, smarter in ways he couldn't articulate, capable of a resilience he had never had to develop. And instead of admiring her for it, he had resented her. He had married her to feel superior, to be the one who lifted her up, the hero of their story. When she got pregnant with quadruplets, when the medical bills started mounting and the future looked like years of exhaustion and sacrifice, he had felt the resentment curdle into something uglier. He hadn't left because of the babies, not really. He had left because Elena would have been the hero of that story, and he couldn't stand being a supporting character. What do I do? He asked Gavin quietly. Gavin finished his drink and stood up. You move on, Mark. You find a job in another city, you change your name if you have to, and you spend the rest of your life trying not to think about what you walked away from. Because I'll tell you one thing for certain, Elena Vane is never taking you back. Not after what you did. He dropped some cash on the table and walked out, leaving Mark alone with his regrets and his empty glass. Meanwhile, Elena was adapting to her new reality with the same determined resilience that had carried her through foster care and poverty and a marriage that had never really seen her. The private medical facility Octavia had arranged was more like a luxury resort than a hospital. Elena had her own suite, with rooms for each of the babies and a team of nurses and specialists who answered her every question with patience and expertise. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to worry about cost. She could focus entirely on healing and bonding with her children. She named them on the third day. The first boy, the one who had arrived screaming at the world with tiny fists clenched in defiance, she named Dorian, after the father she had lost too young to remember clearly. The second boy, quieter and more contemplative, who seemed to study everything with ancient eyes, she named Silas, after the grandfather who had watched over her from afar. The first girl, who had golden undertones in her skin and a way of gripping Elena's finger as if she would never let go, she named Rosalind, after the mother who had loved her fiercely enough for two parents. The second girl, born last and smallest but somehow radiating a calm that settled the entire room, she named Haven, because that was what Elena intended to build for all of them. Dorian, Silas, Rosalind, and Haven. 4 names for 4 lives. 4 reasons to become something more than she had ever imagined. Octavia visited daily, bringing updates on the estate's transition, introducing Elena to the key executives who now reported to her, and answering endless questions about a corporate structure that seemed more complex than most governments. Elena absorbed it all with an intensity that surprised even herself. "You're a natural," Octavia observed one afternoon, watching Elena review quarterly reports with focused attention. "Your grandfather was the same way. He could see patterns in data that others missed. It's why he built the empire he did." "I'm not building anything yet," Elena said. "I'm just trying to understand what I inherited." Understanding is the first step. Building comes next. Octavia paused. "There's something else you should know. Your ex-husband has been making inquiries. He's contacted our legal department 3 times, asking about the possibility of reconciliation." Elena didn't look up from the reports. "And?" "He's been informed that any communication must go through proper channels and that you have no interest in personal contact at this time. But he's persistent. He's also given several interviews to tabloid outlets, painting himself as a victim of circumstance, a man who was overwhelmed by the pressure of expecting quadruplets and made a regrettable decision in a moment of weakness." Now Elena did look up, and her green eyes were hard. "Let him talk. The more he tries to spin this, the more desperate he looks." "That's true. But there's another consideration. He may attempt to establish some claim to the children. Not for custody, he waived that in the divorce filing, but for some kind of visitation or parental involvement. If he's seen as a devoted father who was unfairly cut out, public sympathy might complicate things." Elena was quiet for a long moment. She thought about Mark throwing those papers on her bed. She thought about the way he hadn't looked at the bassinets, not even once. She thought about the word he had used, anchors, as if her children were weights dragging him down. "He won't get near them," she said softly. "Not until they're old enough to decide for themselves whether they want to know the man who called them burdens. And by then, they'll know the whole story." Octavia nodded with something like respect. "Your grandfather would be proud." "My grandfather should have reached out while he was alive," Elena replied, but there was no heat in it. Just sadness, and perhaps a hint of understanding. "But I'm grateful he didn't leave me with nothing to work with." 3 years passed. 3 years that transformed Elena from a newly divorced mother into a force that reshaped industries and challenged power structures that had seemed immutable. She took to her role as head of the Vane Corporation with an intensity that surprised even the board members who had expected a passive figurehead. Within 6 months, she had replaced half of the senior executives, not in vindictive purges, but in careful evaluations that exposed years of self-dealing and mediocrity. She promoted from within, elevating people who had been overlooked because they lacked connections or prestigious backgrounds. She restructured the company's charitable arm, focusing on foster care reform and maternal health initiatives. She funded programs that placed social workers in hospitals to identify new mothers at risk of falling through the cracks. She established trust funds for aging-out foster youth, giving them the safety net she had never had. And she raised her children with a fierce, present love that left no room for the shadows of her own childhood. Dorian, the eldest by 7 minutes, developed his father's artistic sensibilities, constantly drawing on any surface he could find. Silas was methodical and curious, taking apart every toy to understand how it worked. Rosalind was bold and talkative, making friends with everyone from household staff to visiting dignitaries. And Haven, the quiet one, watched everything with observant eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Elena hired tutors and specialists, not to accelerate their development, but to nurture their individual interests. She insisted on being present for bedtimes and meals, even when board meetings ran late. She built the home she had always wanted, not with marble and gold, though she could afford both, but with warmth and laughter and the kind of consistency that said, "You are loved. You are safe. You are enough." Mark Sterling watched all of this from a distance that grew more painful with each passing year. His career never recovered. The leave of absence from Whitmore Financial became a quiet termination. He found work at a smaller firm, then a smaller one still, each step down the ladder accompanied by whispers and knowing looks. He moved to a modest apartment outside the city, far from the social circles that had once welcomed him. He tried dating. Women were initially interested, his looks hadn't faded, and some found the scandal intriguing, but the relationships never lasted. He was bitter now, prone to long silences and sudden flashes of anger when anyone mentioned wealth or success. He couldn't stop talking about Elena, about what he had lost, about the unfairness of it all. Therapists suggested he find closure. Move on. Build a new life. But Mark couldn't let go. The fortune he had walked away from haunted him like a phantom limb, always present in its absence. And then, one evening, he saw his children on television. It was a human interest piece, a soft feature about Elena's charitable work and the family she was raising. The camera showed 4 3-year-olds playing in a garden that looked like something from a fairy tale. A reporter mentioned their names, Dorian, Silas, Rosalind, Haven, and Mark felt something twist in his chest. Those were his children. He had legal rights to them, or he should have. He was their biological father, regardless of what he had signed in that hospital room. Surely the law would recognize that. Surely he could fight for some kind of connection. He called Gavin Merrick, who hadn't spoken to him in over a year. "I need a lawyer," Mark said without preamble. "Someone who specializes in family law. International if possible." Gavin was silent for a moment. "Mark, this is a bad idea. I'm not asking for your opinion. I'm asking for a referral. You signed away your parental rights in the divorce papers. I read about it in the tabloids, just like everyone else." Her legal team made sure that part was very clear. "You can't undo that. There has to be some angle. Duress. Fraud. Something. The only thing there is, Mark, is a $500 billion legal team that will bury you. You go after those kids, and Elena will not just beat you, she will destroy you. Whatever scraps of life you've managed to rebuild, they'll be gone. Mark hung up and stared at the wall of his apartment, at the faded paint and the water stain in the corner and the emptiness that had become his constant companion. He should have listened to Gavin. He should have accepted his defeat and moved on. But Mark Sterling had never been good at accepting that he wasn't the main character. 2 weeks later, he gave an interview to a tabloid journalist named Petra Volkov, a woman with sharp features and sharper instincts who specialized in celebrity takedowns. He told her everything, a carefully edited version of everything, painting himself as a man who had been manipulated by his wife's secret inheritance, who had been pushed out of his children's lives by vindictive lawyers, who was fighting for the right to be a father against an empire that wanted to erase him. Petra knew a good story when she heard one. She published a 3-part series that ran in tabloids across 15 countries, featuring photos of Mark looking sympathetic and sincere, and photos of Elena looking cold and distant, captured at moments carefully selected to reinforce the narrative. The public response was mixed. Some people saw through the manipulation. But others, enough others, began to question whether Elena was as sympathetic as she seemed. Comment sections filled with debates about father's rights and powerful women and the unfairness of wealth. Elena read every article. She watched every television segment. And she felt something cold and familiar settle in her chest, the same feeling she'd had when Mark threw those papers on her bed. The feeling of being underestimated. Dismissed. Reduced to a villain in someone else's story. He's gaining traction, Octavia reported during one of their evening briefings. The sympathy angle is working with certain demographics. If this continues, he may feel emboldened to pursue formal legal action. Let him, Elena said quietly. Elena. I said let him. She looked up from the tablet she was holding, and her green eyes were steady. I've spent my entire life being underestimated. By the system. By employers. By the man I married. I thought being underestimated was a weakness. But I've learned something in the last 3 years. What's that? Being underestimated is a weapon. People who underestimate you don't prepare properly. They don't anticipate what you're capable of. They walk into battles thinking they've already won. Elena set down the tablet. Mark thinks he's fighting a woman who got lucky. He doesn't realize he's fighting someone who's been preparing for this moment her entire life. Octavia studied her for a long moment, then smiled slowly. What do you need from me? Everything you have on Petra Volkov. And schedule a meeting with the board for tomorrow morning. It's time to stop being defensive. The meeting the next morning was brief but decisive. Elena announced that the Vane Corporation would be launching a new media division, not to compete with existing outlets, but to acquire them. Starting with the tabloid empire that had published Petra Volkov's series. The acquisition was completed in 6 weeks. It was entirely legal, entirely above board, and entirely devastating to Mark's public relations campaign. Suddenly, the outlets that had been sympathetic to his story were running corrections, apologies, and new investigative pieces that looked more closely at his claims. The new stories uncovered things Mark had hoped would stay buried. The affair he'd been having during Elena's pregnancy, with a junior associate at Whitmore Financial named Lizette Crane, whose Instagram showed she had been with him the night after he filed for divorce. The debt he had accumulated through gambling, hidden from Elena through a series of increasingly desperate lies. The loans he had taken out against their house without her knowledge, loans that explained why he had been so eager to escape before the bills came due. By the time the truth was fully exposed, public opinion had shifted decisively against Mark Sterling. He wasn't a sympathetic father fighting for his rights. He was a deadbeat who had abandoned his family for another woman and was now trying to cash in on his ex-wife's fortune through manufactured victimhood. The tabloids he had courted now mocked him. The sympathy he had cultivated evaporated. And the legal action he had been contemplating became impossible. No attorney would touch a case so thoroughly discredited. Mark Sterling had gambled everything on a final play, and he had lost. Elena could have left it there. She had won. Mark was destroyed in the court of public opinion, his reputation irreparable, his finances ruined by the legal fees he had accumulated pursuing a fight he could never win. She could have retreated into her empire and her children and never thought about him again. But Elena remembered something her mother had told her years ago, during one of those late-night conversations when Rosalind's defenses were down and her heart was open. "There are two kinds of justice in this world," Rosalind had said. "The kind that the courts give you, and the kind that you take for yourself. The first kind is never enough. The second kind is dangerous. But sometimes, dangerous is necessary." Elena wasn't interested in danger for its own sake. But she was interested in completion. In closing every door that Mark might try to slip through. In ensuring that he understood, finally and completely, what he had thrown away. She arranged a meeting. Not directly, she wasn't interested in seeing his face, but through intermediaries. Mark was informed that a representative of the Vane Corporation wished to discuss a potential resolution to their ongoing conflict. No lawyers, no witnesses. Just a conversation. Mark, desperate and delusional, agreed immediately. He still believed there might be an angle, a pathway back to the life he had abandoned. He still believed that Elena, deep down, must miss him. The meeting took place in a conference room at the Vane Tower, a building that Elena had commissioned 2 years earlier as the new headquarters of her grandfather's empire. It rose 60 stories above the city, its copper-toned glass facade catching the sunset in ways that reminded visitors that this was a kingdom built on metal and minerals. Mark was escorted to the 35th floor by security guards who looked at him like he was something unpleasant stuck to their shoes. He was shown to a conference room with a long table, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a single chair waiting for him at one end. At the other end of the table was a screen. The screen flickered to life, and Elena's face appeared. She was in what looked like a home office, warm and personal, completely at odds with the corporate sterility surrounding Mark. In the background, he could hear children laughing. "Hello, Mark," she said. Her voice was calm, measured, devoid of either warmth or coldness. It was the voice of someone for whom he had simply ceased to matter. "Elena." He tried to summon charm, confidence, anything. "You look well." "I am well. Better than I've ever been, actually. Funny how that works. Look, I know things got out of hand. The interviews, the legal stuff, I was desperate. I was hurting. I know I made mistakes, but I'm still their father, Elena. I still have rights. You have nothing." Her voice didn't rise, but something in it sharpened. "You signed away your rights in that hospital room, Mark. Every legal expert in the world has confirmed it. You are their biological donor, nothing more. You will never be their father. That's not fair." "Fair?" Now there was heat in her voice, carefully controlled but unmistakable. "You want to talk about fair? You left me alone with 4 newborns because they were inconvenient. You called them anchors. You were sleeping with Lizette Crane while I was on bed rest with pregnancy complications. You gambled away money I didn't know we had and then filed for divorce before the creditors could come for both of us. Don't talk to me about fair, Mark. He had no response. Every excuse died on his tongue because she knew. She knew everything. This meeting isn't about negotiation, Elena continued. There's nothing to negotiate. I asked you here to tell you something face to face, or as close to it as I'm willing to get. What? I forgive you. Mark blinked. Whatever he had expected, it wasn't that. I forgive you for the affair, the lies, the gambling, all of it. I forgive you for walking out that day. Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because I deserve peace. Carrying anger toward you would be letting you live in my head rent-free, and you don't get that privilege anymore. She leaned forward slightly, and the light caught her eyes in a way that reminded Mark of something he had once loved and had been too small to keep. But forgiveness isn't absolution, Mark. You will live with what you did for the rest of your life. You will watch my children, grow up in photographs and news coverage. You will see them graduate, succeed, fall in love, have families of their own. And you will know that you chose 30 minutes of freedom over a lifetime of being their father. Mark's throat was dry. Elena, please? There's something else you should know. She reached off-screen and brought back a document. Your financial situation. I've had my team look into it. The debts, the legal fees, the apartment you can barely afford. You're about 6 months away from bankruptcy. If you're offering help. I'm not. Her smile was thin and sharp. What I'm offering is a job. A real one, at the Vane Corporation. Entry level. You'd be working in the mailroom, sorting packages and delivering documents. Minimum wage to start, with performance reviews every quarter. It's honest work. More honest than anything you've done in years. Mark stared at her image on the screen, trying to process what he was hearing. You want me to work in your mailroom? I want to give you a chance to rebuild your life with dignity. Something you never gave me. You can take the job, work hard, maybe eventually become something other than a cautionary tale. Or you can refuse, continue down your current path, and end up exactly where you're headed. This is humiliation. You're trying to humiliate me. No, Mark. Humiliation would be buying the company you work for and firing you publicly. Humiliation would be sending this recording to every outlet that covered your sob story. This is mercy. I'm not sure you recognize it because you've never shown it to anyone else. The screen went dark. Mark sat alone in the conference room, staring at his reflection in the windows, until security came to escort him out. He didn't take the job. Of course he didn't. Pride was all he had left, and he clung to it like a drowning man clutching a lead weight. He would figure something out. He would find another angle. He would prove everyone wrong. 3 months later, he filed for bankruptcy. 6 months after that, he moved in with his mother, who took him back with the cold tolerance of a woman who had run out of options. A year after that, Delphine remarried, husband number 5, and moved to Palm Beach, leaving Mark the small inheritance she had been planning to give him eventually anyway. It was enough to start over. Barely. He moved to a different state, changed his name back to his mother's maiden name, and found work in a car dealership. He sold sedans to families and tried not to think about the 4 children who existed somewhere in the world without him. Sometimes, late at night, he would search Elena's name and read about her latest achievement, her latest charitable project, her latest step toward reshaping the world in her image. He would see photographs of 4 children who looked nothing like him and everything like her, and he would feel the absence of them like a physical wound. He had done this to himself. He knew that now. Every choice, every betrayal, every moment of cowardice, they had all led here, to this empty apartment and this anonymous life and this endless hunger for something he could never have again. And somewhere, in a tower of copper and glass, Elena Vane was living the life she had always deserved. 10 years after the divorce papers hit her hospital bed, Elena Vane stood on the stage of the Global Economic Forum in Geneva, accepting an award for philanthropic innovation. Her foundation had revolutionized foster care systems in 12 countries. Her companies had pioneered sustainable mining practices that were becoming industry standards. Her advocacy had led to legislation protecting maternal rights in workplaces across the developed world. She was no longer just the richest woman on the planet, she was one of the most influential. But none of that compared to the 4 teenagers sitting in the front row, watching her with pride they didn't try to hide. Dorian, at 13, was already an accomplished artist whose work had been featured in youth exhibitions across Europe. He had his grandfather's creative spirit and his mother's determination, a combination that made Elena proud every time she saw him disappear into his studio for hours at a time. Silas was the engineer, the problem solver, the one who was already taking apart drones and building robots that won regional competitions. He had applied to an accelerated science program and been accepted unanimously. His teachers said he was destined for great things. Elena said he was destined for whatever made him happy. Rosalind was the diplomat, the social butterfly, the one who could talk to anyone about anything and make them feel like the most important person in the room. She had her grandmother's beauty and her great-great-grandfather's steel, and Elena could already see the leader she was becoming. And Haven, quiet, observant Haven, was the writer. She kept journals the way Dorian Vane had kept sketch pads, filling them with stories and observations and questions about the world. She was working on a novel, though she was shy about showing anyone. Elena had read fragments of it in secret, and she knew her youngest daughter had inherited more than a name from the grandmother who had raised Elena alone. After the ceremony, the family retreated to their suite in a private hotel, the kind that didn't appear on booking sites and didn't confirm or deny the presence of guests. Elena kicked off her heels and collapsed onto a sofa while her children argued about room service options with the comfortable chaos of siblings who loved each other fiercely. "Mom," Rosalind said, settling beside her, "can we talk about something?" Elena looked at her daughter's serious expression and felt a familiar flutter of parental concern. "Always." "What's on your mind?" "Our father." The room went quiet. Dorian stopped flipping through the menu. Silas set down his tablet. Haven looked up from her notebook. They had all learned about Mark Sterling years ago. Elena had told them the truth when they were old enough to understand, neither demonizing him nor making excuses, but they rarely brought him up. "What about him?" Elena asked carefully. Rosalind exchanged glances with her siblings, some unspoken communication passing between them. "We've been talking. All of us. And we decided we want to reach out to him." Elena's heart did something complicated. "Can you tell me why?" "Not because we miss him," Dorian said quickly. "We can't miss someone we never knew. And not because we want him to be our dad now," Silas added. "You're enough. You've always been enough." Haven spoke softly, her voice the steady anchor it always was. "We just want to understand. There's this piece of our story that we've only heard from one side. We're old enough now to handle the other side. And maybe—" She hesitated. "Maybe we're old enough to decide for ourselves whether he's someone we want to know." Elena looked at her 4 children, these miraculous humans she had brought into the world alone, raised alone, loved enough for two parents. They were asking for something that terrified her. But they were also asking for something that was their right. "If that's what you want," she said finally, "then I'll make it happen. But on one condition." "What?" Rosalind asked. "I'm coming with you. Not to the meeting itself, that should be between you and him, but I'll be nearby. And if at any point you feel uncomfortable, you have the right to walk away without explanation." They agreed. Octavia Langford, now 72 but still sharp as ever, made the arrangements. Mark was located, still living under his mother's maiden name, still selling cars, still existing in the shadow of a choice he couldn't undo. When he received the invitation, he wept. The meeting took place on a neutral ground, a small cafe in a city far from both their lives. Mark arrived early, hands shaking, rehearsing words that would never be adequate. Elena watched from a car across the street, her phone clutched in her hand, ready to intervene at the first sign of trouble. Through the cafe window, she saw her children enter. She saw Mark stand up, his face a map of shock and longing and shame. She saw them sit down, for teenagers looking at the man who had walked away from them before they could take their first breath. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Elena watched every minute of it without hearing a word. When her children finally emerged, they walked to her car in silence. She held her breath as they climbed in, searching their faces for clues. "Well," she asked. Dorian spoke first. "He's sad. Really sad. Not in a way that makes me pity him, exactly. More like he's living in a prison he built himself. He cried a lot," Rosalind added. "Apologized probably 50 times. Said he understood if we never wanted to see him again." "Do you?" Elena asked. "Want to see him again?" The four of them exchanged those glances again, the silent language of siblings. It was Haven who answered. "Maybe. Someday. He's not our father, not really. You're our parent. But he's part of our story, and I think we needed to understand that part to understand ourselves." She paused. "He asked about you. Whether you were happy. Whether you'd found someone." Elena felt something shift in her chest. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That you're the happiest we've ever seen you. That you built an incredible life. That you never talk about him with bitterness, only honesty." Haven smiled slightly. "He looked like that hurt more than anything else we could have said." Elena nodded slowly. She thought about the letters Silas Vane had written, the ones she had read years ago in that Geneva vault. Her grandfather had spent decades carrying the weight of his mistakes, watching from afar, unable to close the distance his pride had created. She had sworn she would never let her children carry that weight. That they would know the truth, make their own choices, and never feel like pieces of themselves were missing because someone hadn't trusted them with the full story. It seemed she had succeeded. That evening, in the hotel suite, Elena sat alone on the balcony after her children had gone to bed. The city lights stretched out below her like a carpet of stars, and she thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. A mother who had loved her enough to sacrifice everything. A grandfather who had watched over her from the shadows. A husband who had shown her exactly what she was worth by leaving when she needed him most. 4 children who had made her stronger than she ever imagined she could be. And herself. Elena Vane, who had been abandoned and underestimated and written off more times than she could count. Who had survived every blow and emerged not just standing, but thriving. She pulled out her phone and found the photo that had been taken earlier that day, her and her children at the awards ceremony, all 5 of them smiling at the camera, the Vane legacy visible in their faces. She posted it to her social media accounts with a simple caption, "Everything I am, I owe to the people who believed in me, and to those who didn't. Both taught me what I was capable of." Somewhere, in a small apartment in a forgettable city, Mark Sterling saw that post. He looked at the faces of the children he would never truly know and the woman who had become everything he had never let her be. And for the first time in 10 years, he didn't feel envy or regret or the bitter sting of loss. He felt something like acceptance. And maybe, if he was honest with himself, something like gratitude. Because Elena Vane had done something he had never managed. She had taken every broken piece of her life and built something beautiful. She had turned abandonment into strength, grief into purpose, and a 30-minute margin into a legacy that would outlast them all. Mark closed his phone and looked out his window at the ordinary street below. He would never be part of that legacy. But perhaps, in walking away, he had given her the freedom to create it. It was the only good thing he had ever done for her. And now, as this story ends, I want to ask you something. If you've made it this far, through the abandonment and the revelation and the rise and the reckoning, then this story meant something to you. Maybe you saw yourself in Elena, surviving against odds that should have been impossible. Maybe you recognized a Mark in your own past, someone who showed you what you were worth by undervaluing you. Maybe you're still waiting for your own inheritance moment, that pivot point where everything changes. This story wasn't just entertainment. It was a reminder that the people who walk away from us don't determine our value. That the struggles we face today might be building the strength we need tomorrow. That sometimes, the greatest revenge is simply living well. If this story moved you, then do something with that feeling. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story that might speak to your soul. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, that friend who's going through a divorce, that family member who feels underestimated, that stranger online who's on the verge of giving up. Stories have power. They change us, connect us, remind us that we're not alone. By subscribing and sharing, you're not just supporting a channel, you're making sure these stories reach the people who need them most. And if you don't? Well, that's your choice. But somewhere out there, someone is feeling exactly how Elena felt in that hospital bed. Alone. Abandoned. Wondering if they're worth fighting for. Your share might be the thing that tells them they are. So subscribe. Share. And remember, the people who leave? They're not ending your story. They're just clearing space for the better chapters still to come.